All right, everybody. Time for another review. This time we have the Pimax Crystal Super 57 PPD module. As it is one of the multiple optical engines for this thing, as Pimax calls them, designed for a modular approach to let you swap out what you see in the Super. With the idea being you can just remove the optical stack at the bottom, like so, and then you just slot it right back in. Easy as that. And this lets you choose between the wider FOV, micro OLED, or super high pixel density, which is what the latter option here does for the 57 PPD module. Compared to the 50 PPD, which I'm using right now, or the ultra wide, it's all about maximizing clarity at all costs, going for a much smaller field of view. It uses the exact same 3840 by 3840 QLED panels of the 50 PPD. So several things I said about that, it also applies to this one. So if you would like a very in-depth look at some things, you can check out my original 57 PPD review, the comfort, local dimming, brightness, mirror, color, software. It's all either the same or close enough. I don't really need to talk about it too much again or just briefly cover it soon. I'll have timestamps on the screen right now for where to watch in that video if you want to see the identical stuff. They'll also be in the description for that video. But the big difference here is these lenses and how they focus the image. Does that make the 57 PPD worth your time, though? Well, the short answer is no. Do not buy this. I'm not going to waste your time. And the long answer is the rest of this video. Normally, I do really like to try and find an audience for any headset and think there is a niche somewhere for everything, even if it's not to my taste. But this module is really hard to justify even when thinking that way. And there might be some people out there who like this despite, all my complaints and after hearing everything I have to say, but I really do not think this is going to be for the vast majority of people at all. Two important disclaimers before we jump into the nitty-gritty though. Firstly, yes, Pimax did send this for free for review purposes, but given what I've already said, you can be sure that's not going to influence my thoughts on this, as I've already recommended against it. Secondly, if you've been following Pimax's announcements since the original one, the 57 PPD was first advertised as having 120 degrees of field of view, and close to that was what was shown off at CES. But after feedback from those showcases, testers, and some other modules coming out, Pimax has decided to revise the 57 PPD specs, aiming to focus on clarity above all else, FOV included. And now they claim 106 degrees. So if you're out of the loop and wonder why some of the specs or impressions here are so different compared to those older ones, that's why. Now then, let's dive into this review. This is going to be structured a little bit differently from my normal reviews given all the problems this has. Firstly, let's start with some of the slight differences from the 50 PPD that can all be lumped into one section. Starting with the local dimming, it's maybe a tiny bit better, but it's not anything you'd notice with that side-by-side, and even then you gotta squint. If you're unaware, local dimming is where you can control zones of the LCD panel compared to having to adjust the entire LCD backlight at once, which in theory gives you better contrast because it gives you finer control that's closer to OLED than having to adjust everything at once. It's not perfect, it's still mostly pretty good, but lack of glare does help somewhat. Most scenes it's pretty alright. The optical engine in this thing is also slightly lighter than the 50 PPD due to the smaller lenses. It's not really a big deal, but it's there. Oh, and also software-wise, Pimax has implemented a band-aid solution to that constant play space issues I've mentioned in my reviews before. That's faster and more intuitive than using a third-party app like FPS VR, nor are you dependent on Steam VR to use it. You just press the Pimax button on the controllers here. It'll take your HMD into pass-through, where you then move your controller to where you want on the floor to be, press the trigger, confirm, done. It's nice Pimax has included their own solution, but obviously, the ideal fix would be to just make the play space properly track. I don't think it's ever going to be truly fixed at this point, though. Okay, now let's get into the actual meaningful differences. Starting with the FOV, it's bad. It's really bad. Using HMDQ to grab the physically rendered values of the headset, we only get rounding to the whole number, 94 vertical, 102 horizontal, and 78 degrees of overlap. This is worse than what the Quest 3 renders. Yes, even on the overlap. If we go over to compare my WIM FOV results, this is actually noticeably smaller than even the Crystal Light, and it has lower overlap than it does. This small FOV is compounded by the lens design here. If you follow me, you know that I've tended to really like Pimax's lens design. I love the 8KX, I love the original Crystal, I love the 50 PPD. They've tended to be my new favorite each time I use them, and I've preferred these lenses to pancake lenses. So I hope that puts extra weight into my words when I say I am so profoundly let down by these lenses. The already tiny FOV feels even more claustrophobic because the edge-to-edge clarity on these makes me feel like I've gone back a whole generation on it. On the 50 PPD, the edge-to-edge clarity is massive. A huge portion of the lens has minimal degradation until you get out to the far edges, if you can live with some bad chromatic aberration on certain elements. This, if you go anywhere outside the very center, your clarity degrades very fast. But on the other hand, to be somewhat fair though, that center clarity is very impressive, and despite the much lower render resolution, it actually does feel comparable to the 50 PPD, but we are going to talk about that shortly since it's not clear-cut as it appears there. To illustrate what I mean with an example I think a chunk of my audience will understand, I'd say that the edge-to-edge clarity on this feels worse than the original Crystal's lenses. Yes, really. In the current era where this aspect of optics is becoming a huge focus, this feels like a step back, and it's such a regression going from being able to very comfortably move my eyes around to look at things to having to again move my head if I want to find anything that's a small detail and look at it in focus. And we're also not done yet because the chromatic aberration is so much worse on this than the 50 PPD. It further contributes to that not good feeling when you move your eyes around. I'm gonna try and make a mock-up on screen of how bad the peripheral area feels, but it's so bad on certain elements, like actual triple vision for smaller details. I'm not too sure even this does it justice. On bigger things, though, to be a little fair, like say larger geometry or in more muted environments found within Half-Life Alyx, yes, it is meaningfully better there, but it's still not the best. In more vibrant and bright areas, like Kayak VR's forested area, though, it's a terrible, distracting time. And if you thought I was done, I'm not, because there's more issues. There are distortions on the image too, and not just edge distortions. I mean, there are distortions right in the middle of your view. This is not going to show up on the recording, but if I move my head when looking at menus with a lot of little fine details, like say the Steam VR one, I can see it warp, stretch, and distort in the center of my vision. The 50 PPD is near perfect doing the same thing. Now, for much more slower pace things where you're not going to move your head a lot, like say, such as a calming cruise through Kayak VR's beautiful scenery, the distortions are much less noticeable. And for stuff like that kind of pace, I could maybe see how somebody less sensitive or less annoyed by it could overlook those. For that kind of stuff, the module is much better of a use case, but even then, it still feels like just an okay time if you don't mind moving your head around. But for quick things where you are throwing your head around and moving rapidly, like say a multiplayer FPS, this is a very bad time. And we are still going down the negatives because the sweet spot on this thing, that is how hard it is to find the optimal clarity. A lot of people kind of just merge this and edge to edge under the same thing, but they're not. That's perhaps the tiniest one I have ever seen. It took me so long to find it, perhaps longer than any headset I've ever used, that for a time I did question if I even could find it. The auto IPD with the eye tracking did not help me here. And because of just how bad this has been versus most of my Pimax experiences, I still wonder if maybe I haven't found it, but I am very confident I have, because it was actually worse for a while, especially if you read my initial first impressions, where I was much softer on it there because I was operating under the presumption that, okay, this is just a couple hours, maybe it'll be better if I find the sweet spot, but no, it didn't really get better. It got very slightly better, so that's why I think I did end up finding the sweet spot, but it's just not good here. And even if I still somehow haven't found the sweet spot, that speaks volumes, because I've been able to find it on every single headset I've used without too many issues. The 57 PPD is just really crippled by its lenses. And I hate to say that because how much I've loved most of Pimax's lenses, or found them decent-ish at worst for my personal tastes. Save the 42 ppd. Now we get to clarity and performance, which I've grouped into one category because those actual good points, the center sharpness and the performance, I'm immediately going to undercut. So, despite how poor the edge-to-edge is on this, the center clarity of the 57 ppd, it actually is amazingly sharp and is an incredible visual experience. Because despite the fact it has a vastly lower render resolution than the 50 ppd, it actually manages to look even sharper despite nearly half the rendered pixel count. Let that absurdity sink in. Now, some of you may be wondering, well, how is this even possible? Well, allow me to explain, as there are two elements at play here. Both are related to the FOV. So the 50 ppd and the 57 ppd, as stated, use the exact same panels. Imagine this picture on screen represents the 50 ppd, while this grid mockup has the squares as the individual pixels. Now, let's pretend the FOV is being reduced to something much smaller. In this case, the 57 ppd's visuals, but we're still utilizing the full panel. We're not simply cropping the image, and despite what the visuals show right now, because I'm limited by YouTube's aspect ratio trying to demonstrate this, so just ignore that. Now, because of this, the image and the grid gets smaller as well. The pixels are more densely packed, hence the higher pixels per degree of the 57 ppd module. So yes, it's partially the 50 ppd is being stretched over a wider area. However, this is also not the only aspect at play here, as due to the nature of VR and lenses, the image sent to the headset is pre-distorted and warped to counter distortion caused by the lenses. You can think of it kind of like this. Wider FOV is a very, very expensive thing to do for several reasons, as you need to do further distortion correction compared to smaller FOV with how you're stretching the image. This can be seen on Pimax's original Crystal headset, where the wider FOV lenses had a higher render res than the normal 35 ppd ones, but the 42 ppd, which were far more narrow in field of view, had a significantly smaller render res, despite all of them utilizing the panel in similar ways. Even Meta's CTO, Andrew Bosworth, has said wide FOV is expensive as hell. Let me just roll the clip.
The trade-offs on weight, form factor, compute, thermals, it's all bad. Field of view is one of the most expensive things you can add to a headset.
Higher and higher render resolutions are needed to get that 1-to-1 pixel to display ratio as FOV increases here, as the distortion correction process is lossy and that over-rendering helps make up for the loss of detail. This can also be seen with things like the Megami X's community profile, where if you seriously ramp up and expand the FOV, you also need to aim for a higher render target to hit that 1-to-1 pixel to display ratio, which is important, as it is effectively where you are fully utilizing the display and what you could truly call native if you wanted to split hairs about VR rendering, since every rendered pixel corresponds to a physical pixel on the screen after the loss from distortion correction, to make it very brief. Now, this all said, whatever 100% res is set on the headset does not necessarily mean you're automatically hitting that. Unless the company states what's needed for it, I don't think we can figure it out without access to distortion profile data. But the point is, bigger FOV means bigger number for that. Optics are really a very complicated thing, and you can do a lot in them to work around some of this stuff to an extent or get better results than others, but the general principle is just kind of a fact of life of VR. Anyway, point is that despite the far lower render resolution of the 57 ppd, you do indeed get incredible sharpness in the center, which in turn means way better performance for similar, if not better, visuals. I could actually run this without needing the most powerful GPU on the planet, and I'm sure that's a notable reason for the module being appealing to people. Pimax has even used it in the advertising. But, here's the thing. This review took so long that Pimax recently added the ability to crop your FOV into their software, so I had to redo a huge chunk of this to accommodate for that. And furthermore, on a similar note, you can also use mods such as the OpenXR Toolkit fork by Oni Speed to further customize your FOV. Link to that and their video will be down in the description. And this is important to talk about because if you do play a game which is OpenXR Toolkit compatible, and I think most of my audience are tinkering enthusiasts, the 50 ppd can actually have a similar render resolution but provide some better specs. If you don't play games that are compatible with it or aren't a power user, well, then I do think it's still important to talk about because there's notable limitations and general considerations for this feature on both Pimax and the mod if you are somebody who is suddenly tempted to try this out. If you use the narrow FOV mode in Pimax's software with the 50 ppd here, the rendered values come out to this. If we stack this beside the 57 ppd, the horizontal is slightly better, but the vertical and stereo overlap of the 50 ppd are absurdly improved versus the 57. We're talking like almost 25 degrees better. Now, if we check the 1.0 render res of the 50's modes and compare them to the 57 ppd is still far better, yes, but the narrow mode on the 50 ppd is now only 57% higher now versus the almost double that it was before per eye. It's still not a free lunch since the extra FOV is costly. However, as this is cropping the peripheral section, the center clarity of the 50 ppd does remain intact versus when you just simply adjust the resolution slider at full FOV, causing the whole image to lose detail for the reasons I just mentioned earlier. If you can't use the OpenXR toolkit for whatever reason, such as its limitations with most DX12 games, or if you prefer to play SteamVR, as the OpenXR toolkit's cropping method does not work properly with Pimax under Steam, then the 57 ppd's much lower pixel count definitely does have relevance if you are truly chasing every single drop of performance. If, however, you are playing a game which is compatible with the OpenXR toolkit, I think this is where things get really embarrassing for the 57 ppd. Going into a game like Bring Traveler to test with, if I take the 50 ppd's narrow FOV mode and crop the FOV, not even the stereo overlap, down to match the 57's, well, this is a joke I'm not laughing about. The 50 ppd only has a render resolution that is now 10% higher than the other module, but you are getting vastly better stereo overlap and lenses in that res. But we aren't done here. If I decide to crop the stereo overlap as well, the 50 ppd's render res actually ends up lower than the 57. Though, this said, cropping to this extreme is more obvious on the 50 ppd as the lenses were not set up with this in mind, so I wouldn't recommend cropping the stereo overlap to such an extent. But just cropping the vertical FOV and a little bit of the horizontal, absolutely viable, and you get a very close render resolution. Is the 57 ppd sharper in this scenario still? Yes, it is, because unlike the 50, it's utilizing more of the panel and is set up to physically resolve more detail. But it's not that large of a gap, and it comes with significant trade-offs elsewhere, like those terrible lenses. I just wish they would also add something like this for the vertical as well. And trust me, if they do add vertical adjustment, that will be the final nail in the coffin for this module, since you won't even need a mod with sketchy compatibility at that point. Now, this line of thought brings us to the conclusions and where the 57 ppd is in light of all these problems. And that place is not a good one. The 57 ppd has some bad lenses which sacrificed everything purely for the sake of high clarity right in the dead center. It is ultra sharp in that pinpoint small area, but this comes at the cost of almost last gen like edge to edge clarity, immense chromatic aberration that pulls you out of the experience, notable distortions of the image, and what might be the smallest field of view on a modern headset that feels extremely out of place in a form factor like this. It's one of only two advantages over the 50 ppd module, that is the much lower render resolution, is completely obliterated if you are somebody who plays games that are compatible with the OpenXR toolkit. If you aren't somebody who uses that, or your games don't work, then yes, that lower render resolution is still a selling point. Unless Pimax adds the ability to adjust it, they might do that in the future, in which case this thing's going to be very pointless. But even then, even if we don't talk about that for a minute, is that one thing worth all the other trade-offs. If the headset had lenses just as good as the original Crystal did, which, reminder people, had more field of view than this, I might have had a much easier time recommending this to a specific type of user. But it doesn't, which is then made worse when you remember the price of this thing. The QLED super modules, by themselves and off sale, are $700 before any kind of taxes. Or, if you are buying a whole headset, that's $1,700. These are expensive, and I'm going to hold them to a high standard accordingly. I'm not going to give this headset the same charity I would one at half the price. The visual experience is VR, and if that sucks, then what's the point? This also isn't like a huge difference in display technology, such as QLED versus micro OLED. The 57PPD does not exist in a vacuum where it's the only headset that provides a certain type of experience, so that naturally begs the question of why not get the good one providing similar traits which cost the same? And to this, I think there's almost no good answer. There is maybe some relevance if you mainly play games where you can't further crop the FOV, but if Pimax adds in vertical cropping, then that's pretty much game over. The executioner's axe is hanging over this module's neck solely from that possibility. I know I've basically made this a 57 versus 50 PPD video, but I can't not mention these with opportunity cost being a thing. They're by the same company, for the same headset, same lenses, same screens. If you're somebody who's looking at the Crystal Super and value the traits those screens give, like the super high brightness, just get the 50 PPD. Even if you aren't a power user, it's a more diverse and capable headset, because if you want to crop your FOV to be smaller but still have high clarity, well, that's an option. Or do you want the big FOV for a great sense of speed in a racing sim? It can do that too. There might be people out there who have theirs and are quite happy with it, or who still are interested despite all my moaning because they value that super high clarity over everything else, even if it's still not that big of a difference. More power to you if you are one of those people, and I hope you're happy with it. If you are, by all means, share that in the comments below. I'd like another perspective, and I don't think anyone should make me their sole source of opinions for this stuff with how individualized VR is. But I just could not recommend the 57 PPD to a single person I know right now. And this module feels like it was done solely so Pimax can shout to the heavens about retina clarity, human eye resolution in the marketing, which you could also argue isn't even true now, given how murky that whole human eye resolution thing is, especially given a recent study which may indicate that the average is a lot higher than we initially thought. Rant over. There is the video. Probably one of the more negative ones I've done, and I don't like being like this, as funny as it can be to watch me rant. If you made it to the end here, well, consider subscribing to see what I do next. Maybe an ultra-wide module review, because oh boy, I got some words to say about that one too. If not, thanks for sticking around anyway, and maybe I will see you again in the recommended sometime. Later.